So I was saying, thank you for joining our call today. My name is Miranda Black, and I'm a research coordinator at FEAST Center for Indigenous STBBI Research, a project that studies the impact of sexually transmitted bloodborne illnesses and their impact in Indigenous communities. I am a person of Mohawk ancestry and mixed bloodlines. My family is from Tyinaniga territory, which is about 2.5 hours north of Toronto. If you like to talk today, please follow us on Facebook at FEAST Center for Indigenous STBBI Research and on Eventbrite as we host monthly conversations that we would love to share with you. A couple of housekeeping notes is that there's 3 rules. 1, please be respectful to other participants. Please be respectful in the chat. Sometimes things can come up that might be triggering. So please keep the chat respectful, and also please be inquisitive and put any questions that you might have into the chat. We're trying to get, we'll try to get to all of your questions at the end of today's sessions when we do our Q&A portion of the conversation. And then also please be mindful to have your mic and video turned off during the conversation so that we can record this conversation and send it all to you through our FEAST Center YouTube channel. I'd like to start today with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that McMaster University is located on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and other nations. What's known now as Paradise Point, located on the McMaster campus, was once a place where families would meet to gather wild rice for generations prior to colonialism. We're gathering today virtually from many locations across what's called Canada, but all of these locations are Indigenous lands that are shared with settlers and peoples from across the globe. It's important to know that Parliament of Canada is on unceded Algonquin territory, and that although treaties between Indigenous peoples in Canada are fundamental to the Constitution and legal practices in this country, as we approach over 260 years of colonial colonization, the agreements written into these treaties, including the Royal Proclamation, have not been upheld by Canada. Therefore, it is our responsibility as Indigenous peoples, allies, and settlers on Turtle Island to continue the work that we do as researchers, physicians, and frontline workers, while increasing awareness that we are all treaty people and we all have the responsibility to make change for future generations. I'll now pass it over to our host, Doris Peltier, a longtime organizer for the HIV movement, community engagement coordinator at FEAST Center for Indigenous STBBI Research, and host of the soon-to-be-released podcast, Indigenous Sexual Futures. Doris?
Thank you, Miranda, for that beautiful introduction. Before we get started, I'd like to invite our elder, who is also on the panel today. He's going to be functioning in a dual role today on this panel, as an elder within the movement and also as a panelist for this conversation today. So I'd like to call on Elder Albert McLeod to get us started in a good way. Albert?
Thank you, Doris, and welcome everyone to this session today. My name is Albert McLeod. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and we are in the winter time here now. It is -37 with the wind chill Celsius. So it is quite cold out, and we can expect this weather to be like this for the next 3 or 4 months. And so as part of the opening, it is an invocation to the natural world to call into the spiritual world to guide us as humans when we do this work, particularly talking about infectious diseases or pandemics like HIV or COVID-19, the recent one. And as Indigenous people, we know that we rely on the natural world, the spiritual world, to guide us in our deliberations. And as we're told in this area, which are Treaty 1 people, as well as the homeland of the Métis people, the Red River Métis in this area, that the natural world, we're highly dependent on this natural world, even though we live in the 21st century, We seem that we can control it, manipulate it, and in many ways we're removed from the urgency of dealing with cold or heat for that matter. So we're told to acknowledge the winds that bring these different seasons we have here, the spring, the summer, the fall, and the winter, because our world tilts away from the sun. And as it spins, it brings these seasons into our world, and we learn to live with them and adapt to them. So today is very cold, and you couldn't be outside with, without good covering. And so we acknowledge that power of nature. And so we open those doorways of the winds of the east. Invite those spirits to join us today, to see us, to hear us, and to help us if they can. We turn to the south doorway and we open those doorways and invite those winds or spirits to join us. We turn to the west and we open those doorways and invite those spirits to join us, to see us, to hear us, and help us if they can. And we turn to the north wind that brings the cold. And the cold is necessary for this part of the world. In the snow will be used in the spring as water to replenish our earth, to bring the plants and the animals back and the water back again. And so we look to the earth below, the water, the plants, and the animals that give us life. Look to the sky above, the world that reflects our natural world here on Earth, the world of the universe where the moon, the stars, the planets, the sun, and habitate. We draw on those parts of the natural world to populate our stories that we tell to our children about creation, about the rules of behavior of humans in relationship to the natural world. And it is a world we will return to one day as spirit. And finally, we encircle the humans into all of creation, the seventh direction, the last creation, the human beings. And it's a reminder today that we are a part of creation. We don't control it, and we have to approach creation with humility because it's a lot older than we are. And the world that we inhabit will be here long after we're gone. So magwitch, everybody, and welcome to this session today.
Oh, miigwech, Albert. Ani bojo. Kwenda gzit nishnekas, wawashkesh do dem. Nishnabe kwenda wikwem kong donjiba. So I just acknowledged my spirit name and my clan to the ancestors so that they know it's me that's speaking, and I spoke in my language. So welcome to the Feast Center Conversation Series. This is our third, possibly the fourth conversation in this series, and I'm your guest host today. My name is Doris Pelche, and as part of Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week 2022, the Feast Center for Indigenous STBBI Research is hosting this conversation, which we titled The History of Indigenous HIV and AIDS in Canada, a retrospective with ChangeMakers. Today being the last day of Indigenous AIDS Awareness Week 2022, we felt it was important to look back at key inflection points of the Indigenous HIV and AIDS movement in Canada. Our guests today are key voices, advocates, community-based researchers. In the last little more than a decade, some community-based researchers have stepped out of their advocacy roles into research. And we also have, we are also the stakeholders of the wisdoms and knowledges of the movement here in Canada. So this conversation is bringing together these community leaders, activists, and elders to discuss that history, of HIV and AIDS, and how this epidemic has historically impacted Indigenous people, and how these leaders are working to make change for the future generations. So I want to welcome our speakers for today. We have Albert McLeod, who you just heard from. He's functioning as an elder and as an advocate in this conversation. And then we have Richard Jenkins, who is also an advocate from Alberta, a Métis, and I also call him an elder. And we have Martin Moberg, who represents kind of the next generation, in my view, for the work that, moving forward with the HIV and AIDS work as we continue to address this in our communities. And he represents the future for me. And then Keisha Larkin is also slated to join this conversation. And we will ask her to introduce herself when she joins the conversation. So without further ado, we're going to get started. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists today to kind of introduce themselves, rather than, the standard kind of presentation. Sometimes somebody reads their bio. I just want each of our panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves. And you just take a few minutes to do that. You have up to 5 minutes. So who wants to go first? Martin. Oh, Albert.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I come from northern Manitoba, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s in the north. And I'm a gay person, a gay person who has ancestry that is Scottish immigrant, as well as Northern Cree. And my family worked in the Hudson Bay fur trade for over 100 years. I grew up in the north, but I ended up going to Vancouver 1979, and I ended up in the midst of the global pandemic of HIV, just as it was happening around the world. And I joined a society there of Indigenous people who were LGBTQ called the Greater Vancouver Native Cultural Society. And I've been very fortunate because wherever I've gone, there seemed to be a strong cultural aspect of welcoming the outsider into your territory, the sharing of culture, tradition, ceremony, and a community as Indigenous peoples, whether it was BC or Manitoba and other parts of Canada. I began an HIV/AIDS educator in 1991. And worked for 10 years doing that in Manitoba, and also was a co-founder of the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, now known as Community Alliances and Networks, which again did a lot of education around HIV/AIDS nationally in Canada from the Indigenous perspective. And I've also been involved with the 2S LGBTQ movement as part of, I think, my response to HIV, the reality of HIV, and been an educator, outreach coordinator, and an advocate, as Doris has mentioned a few times, an advocate at the local level and the national level around issues about Indigenous culture, Indigenous rights, and around HIV and Two-Spirit identity. And living in Winnipeg, I've had a great opportunity to work with Indigenous experts in the culture and in the language, which have been a great support to the work I've been doing in health and traditional healing. There.
Aha, miigwech. Okay, I'm just gonna not ask for a volunteer. I'm gonna voluntold people. So I'm going to pull in Martin Moberg at this point. Martin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor to sit with you guys today with the panel. It's kind of like a testament for me when I get to join these conversations, because it kind of shows me like how much time has passed and the spaces that I'm very fortunate to sit in. But my name is Martin Morberg, and like without a bio, I'm a bush kid. I'm from the mountains. I'm from up in the Yukon Territory. I was raised around a lot of Indigenous women, and really strong ones too, that really helped me shape my views and values. Was raised around the potlatch system as well, the Tlingit potlatch system. And then later in my life, started learning about some of the protocols and laws and the way Northern Shoshone people govern themselves. So I was able to really have kind of an earlier education of how my Indigenous people where I come from, how they govern themselves. I've been living with HIV for like 10 years, and it wasn't like intentional to get into activism. I feel like a lot of the hardships of my own life kind of pushed me into the arms of this Indigenous HIV kinship and this kind of two-spirit family. And like, I was just thinking too, like there was I met this 17-year-old two-spirit person, this two-spirit guy, when I was just kind of stepping into the movement, and he was living with HIV. And I remember telling him, I said, I've been knocking on all these doors. I'm trying to make things happen. I'm trying to work in the community. I'm trying to get into this grassroots work. And I'll never forget what he told me, this 17-year-old. He said, if you want to be heard, you got to make some noise. And so it was just these little kind of, and for that to come from such a young, powerful voice really resonated with me. So I don't know, like, I feel like a lot of the activism and things that have happened have really just like come from the community. And like, I didn't kind of intentionally set out to start doing this work. It's just been like based on the relationships that I've made with other activists, other mentors and role models that I've had that have kind of brought me into the work and kind of where I am today, like working in the community. So there's my informal introduction.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin. Yes, I usually like to ask guests to tell about themselves, something that's not in your bio, so that we get to know who you are in a different kind of way. So I'm going to move over to Richard now. Richard Jenkins, you're up next.
Thank you. Tansatawaya, everyone. I'm calling in today from Manitoba, the place where we gather eggs. It's now called St. Paul, Alberta. It's in the Treaty 6 territory, just west of Moose Hills, which is where I'm from. I'm a bush half-breed. I'm a Cree, now I say I'm Cree Métis with Indian status. And I struggle with using the term Métis because there's this copyright on it. You have to, fit certain parameters. And I was a Métis, politically, culturally. I had a card for the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'm from Zone 2 in the Alberta area, what is now called Alberta. Pre-Confederation was Saskatchewan. I'm close to the Saskatchewan border. Who else am I? I'm 59 years old. I'll be 60 in April. I'm enjoying the last little bits of my 50s. And next year I won't be able to say that anymore. It'll be forever gone to this body. I'm the only son to Richard, the late Richard Jenkins, and the late Teresa Patra, who passed away as Teresa Jenkins Whiskey Jack. She remarried before she passed. And I'm 7 in a line of 9 of, there would have been 9 of us. And the other 8 would have been all girls. And the 6 that did survive were all alive until a year and a bit ago, or a few years ago. My oldest sister passed away a few years ago. So there's only 5 sisters, living sisters left. And we're all pretty close. We're like a ladder. So we're all fairly close in age, which makes a big difference in terms of what I say, camaraderie, familiarity, or familialness, the act of being in family. And I'm a singer, I'm a dancer, Métis. I love pop ballads. I wear my heart out on my sleeve when I go to karaoke. I'm the guy who sings all the hurting songs. Because in my life, I try to be, loving hearts and peace of flowers, and everything's wonderful and everything's rosy, and, an optimist and positive and all that stuff, not just HIV positive, but positive in character and countenance. And so I'm very grateful for what I have in my life, and being able to say that I come from a pretty good family, pretty supportive family. And I've done lots of addictions work. I've helped develop addictions programs in Ontario. I've helped develop, I was there at the beginning of the Ontario Aboriginal HIV AIDS strategy. I was one of the co-founders, one of the co-authors to that. And helped develop, I was the first Canadian board member on the World Indigenous Nations Higher Education Consortium on behalf of the Nietzsche Institute, where I trained counselors and did marketing and research, community-based research. Back in the day, my first job with Nietzsche was a research assistant on native employee assistance programs. How do we help people stay well in work? So I have, I come from a long line of activists. My late grandfather was, the late Lloyd Patra was one of the co-founders to a rehab center here in Alberta. My late mother was a senator with the National Association of Friendship Centers. My great grandfather was one of the founding leaders to the Métis Nation of Alberta, as well as the Indian Association of Alberta. Had a dance crew that he took all over the place, to Ottawa, here, there, and everywhere, Métis dance crew. And yeah, there's a big story about that late great grandfather, JF Dion, Joseph Francis Dion. And I was named, one of my names is named after him. And he's a Métis leader, a First Nations leader here in Alberta. He was kind of a middle of the ground person. It's kind of like me, kind of, the in-between person. He's not fully Métis, he wasn't fully First Nations, he was kind of in between. And he kind of could walk between those worlds. And so I kind of take that, and I've been walking with, how do I be an in-between person? And I'm one of the people who helped found the first Canadian Two-Spirit, Indigenous Two-Spirit Plus organization here in Canada. I was part of the development of the Edmonton Two-Spirit Society and Two-Spirits in Motion Society, and that Albert is also part of. And yes, I'm a Two-Spirit gay fella. And when I was younger, I had very short hair. I didn't have all this white stuff. I didn't look like Santa Claus. And I had a lot of privilege with my looks. And I was in shape. I danced. I played sports, volleyball and fastball in the summer, volleyball in the winter. And I was never a hockey player. It was a little bit too violent for me. I didn't like basketball. It was also a little bit violent. I know it's not supposed to, but there's elbows and legs and people get tripped. Anyway, that's a bit about who I am. And I'm currently single, and I live in the country. So that creates some challenges in terms of being able to be physical in the world today. And there's all kinds of new things happening anyway. So I'm probably better off being in the bush with very little access to sexuality. So I'm
Okay,
pleased to-
Miigwech, Richard. It sounds like you come from royalty, from Indigenous royalty, in that long line of shakers and movers. I mean, all of you come from Indigenous royalty in my book. So, you know, when you talk about your where you come from and everything, it's you know, you've got a long heritage that you very proud peoples that you come from, each of you. So we're going to get started with some questions here, and we're going to begin with Albert. And you know, and the question has been posted in the chat, and we know that you were involved in the early response in caring for Indigenous people living with HIV from the beginning of the epidemic, when two-spirited people were the first ones that were impacted. Could you tell us take us a little bit through what that was like, Albert, as that advocate? You know, what made you put your advocate hat on in that time period? You have to unmute.
Yeah, in those days, in the early days of the pandemic, you know, from the 80s into the 90s, it really was a time where there was no treatment for HIV infection. So people, you know, did progress into the end stage of HIV disease, or what is called AIDS, and had, you know, developed opportunistic infections that were usually only seen in very old people. And they were very serious infections like toxoplasmosis of the brain, Kaposi sarcoma, a skin cancer, wasting disease where you couldn't process nutrients. So it was very dramatic in terms of seeing young people progress to being quite ill, being palliative, not having family supports or any social supports. The stigma was very virulent then. The fear was quite, you know, strong of exposure and contact, getting HIV just by touching. So there are a lot of myths about HIV and AIDS. And so that was, for us, that generation, we had to learn how to provide palliative care, end of life care, you know, support people in dying, in isolation, really. Many of the people, usually the gay or bisexual men, never made it back to their families or reserves or communities just because of the fear and stigma. And so for us, it was a steep learning curve about that whole, you know, going from, you know, being in the disco scene in Vancouver or Montreal or Toronto to being in the palliative care wards of hospitals. Like we that was our life, right? It was both in the gay bar scene and in the hospitals caring for our friends. And in terms of the mental, emotional, psychological part of that, there was really no place to bring that. So, you know, people didn't really necessarily want to hear about it. So there was a lot of social, psychological isolation in that period. And then it wasn't until 1988 that the Indigenous Health Service, or Indian Health Services in the US, held a gathering in Minneapolis because they were obligated to address HIV among Indigenous gay and bisexual men. And that was the first international two-spirit gathering. So I like to characterize as early as 1988, the Indigenous response in North America to this HIV pandemic began. And it was led by two-spirit people in that we explored our identities, our histories, our ceremonies, our healing technologies, our languages, and we've been on that journey for 35 years now. So it's a teaching in that reclaiming identity and culture is a response to a pandemic. And I think we saw it as well as with COVID. So in many ways, it was the coming out of Two-Spirit or Indigenous LGBTQ people, because literally our backs were up against the wall. There was no future because of just the stigma, the lack of any knowledge or support around HIV prevention. And the treatment didn't become effective until the early 2000s. So there was a 20-year period where we really had to stand up for ourselves, and we did. And I think that's why where we are today, right? Is that we broke through some of those barriers. We worked with government, we did research, we went into communities and did HIV 101. And it was the first time in many of these communities, First Nations, Métis or Inuit communities, that people ever talked about sexuality in a public way, because we knew it was sexually transmitted. So we needed to talk about, heterosexual sex, gay sex, drug use, injection drug use. And in many cases, it was the first time that the community ever gathered to have these conversations. So in many ways, it was cutting edge, breaking down barriers. And so again, my experience goes back 40 years. So there's a lot there. But I like to center that the annual International Two-Spirit Gathering is an example of an Indigenous response to the HIV pandemic. You're muted, Doris. Your turn.
My turn to unmute. Thank you, Albert. I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question in this conversation in terms of the level of stigma that was experienced by Indigenous people living with HIV. What was the level of stigma towards our peers?
Well, I think many times families stayed away. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to provide support because, again, those opportunistic infections were very serious. And, sometimes people would go blind, right? Sometimes they would lose weight, so they were just skin and bones, and they needed to be in a wheelchair. And so a lot of times family just did it. There was no path. There was no toolkit for people to follow, right? And so many times, like in Vancouver, Laurie McDonald, who was with the Greater Vancouver Native Cultural Society, she was the one who went around and she would collect the cremated ashes of people who had died in Vancouver from across Canada who were Indigenous and whose family didn't respond at all. People were just cut off, died in a hospital, were cremated, and their ashes were never retrieved. And I believe in Canada, there's still ashes sitting in crematoriums, not just for Indigenous people only, but other Canadians who died of AIDS, that there are ashes just still sitting there waiting to be retrieved. So she would go and she would put those ashes into the ocean beside Vancouver as a way of closure. So like Richard had said earlier, people could cut themselves off mentally, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically from their loved ones because of the fear and the stigma. And I saw it happen many times. And so yeah, it is that fear is real. It's still real in the 21st century. That stigma is still real. And the myths are still real about, not having the accurate information, actually how HIV is transmitted today.
Thank you, Miigwech. I'm gonna go to Richard now. I think this is a really good segue to invite Richard. And I have a question for you, Richard. To prepare for this conversation, I Googled all of you actually, and did my homework. And so in Googling you, Richard, I found a story titled Teacher, Helper, My Relationship with HIV. And I read that article, and in that article, you talk about the first time that you disclosed to your family, that you disclosed your HIV status. How did their response frame your journey of living with HIV from that point onward? And the question's also in the chat box. How has that motivated your continued advocacy in the work that you continue to do?
Okay, yeah, good question. Like I said earlier in my introduction, I'm pretty close with my sisters and with a lot of my cousins, my first cousins on both my mom's side and my dad's side, probably less on my dad's side, but one of the things that you know, as I've reflected on the question, is it helped cement my trust in family, because they didn't say, oh, you're not welcome in my home, I don't want you, there's something wrong with you. Like, I didn't get any of that kind of response. I got, you know, the natural normal tears, and then I got annoyance. One of my sisters was, well, you're going to come and help me tell my kids. And it was kind of a demand. It wasn't, can you come and please help me? It was like, well, you're going to come and do this. Like, it was like this very direct expectation that I was going to help her process the news with her children. And I did that, and it was fine, and it was anticlimactic. Kids were like, yeah, okay, can we go and play now? So again, like, trusting in being able to share that with my family. I flew across Canada I was working in Toronto at the time, and it took me several months to work up the courage to go home, to fly home, to find somebody. One of my friends, Ruth Cardinal de Ubiera is her name now. She used to be Ruth Cardinal, Ruth Hunter, Ruth Warren. She used to be the CEO of Nietzsche Institute. Anyway, I phoned her and I said I had to kind of give her the heads up. And I told her over the phone, I feel bad about that, but I wasn't really rich in being able to travel, fly, you know, at a whim. But I did book that flight, and I booked that trip, and coordinated with my friend Ruth, and met her at her office, and I asked her to, you know, call my family in. And some of them came. They didn't all show up. One of the sisters, I couldn't quite get to her, so I did have to tell her over the phone. I felt really bad about that, but it was what it was, and it is what it is. And but yeah, the thing that had helped me cement into my person and into my place in my family, my place and my power in my family, is because I'm the only boy, the only male, that has a certain privilege in my family. I was treated a certain way. Because I sing and I dance, you know, I'm a performer. I have that look at me kind of energy. And I was a trainer. I love standing in front of people and telling story and, you know, sharing information and learning, sharing teachings about, you know, this, that, and the other thing, and helping people learn skills, knowledge, change their attitudes and their behaviors. So yeah, so for me, the family is so important. I come from a very large Métis family who were always about music and dance and performance and being there for each other. And it's interesting, you know, when I came out of the closet as a gay guy, more of my uncles seemed to be okay with me than my aunts. Just my own perspective in terms of what happened and what's happened since. And I've always felt more accepted by the male relatives on my mom's side, not so much my dad's side. Again, didn't have as much interaction on my dad's side. But yeah, family. So trust, it really helped build trust, and really gave me the impetus to keep doing the work of being a community helper in addictions work, because there's so many intersections between addictions and the people who experience HIV and other STBBIs and other chronic illnesses and mental health challenges. Kind of, there's this huge intersection. I just wanted to throw that word in here. Intersectionality is the, you know, the buzzword of the day in terms of gender-based explorations. And so So trust in family and trust in myself within that context of family is huge. And I learned to trust in that process and through that experience of doing that sharing and the crying and the support and come and help me tell my family. And I don't know how many people, the older folks online, remember the movie An Early Frost with Aidan Quinn, I think was his name. He was one of the actors in that movie. And it came out in the 80s or something. And I was with a guy at the time who was HIV positive. And we did not have a lot of safe sex, and I was safe the whole time I was with him. I did not contract the virus. So, in my brain, that created this false belief that I was never going to get it, because if I didn't get it from him, how could I get it from anybody else? But I learned later on some of the HIV AIDS 101 sessions I would go to, and people say, oh, you can't get it from oral sex. And I would think to myself, well, actually, yeah, you can. If the guy's really big and you're greedy and you just got to get it all the way down, he's going to tear and rip your throat. And it's a tender space in your body. And that's how I contracted the virus. The guy did tell me he was HIV positive. He had just lost his partner to AIDS. And I said, yeah, we'll be okay. I'll be okay. But here I am, and I wasn't. I wanted to just point out the intersection between the year that I contracted the virus and the year our elder Myra Laramie had her sacred dream and vision about Two-Spirited, and that image and the ability to shift between male and female. And since that time and in my life and in the early 2000s, when I started to learn and connect to Two-Spirit teachers, I learned a whole bunch of things about the connection and the intersection between those two experiences, Myra and her connection to Two-Spiritedness, and my own connection with HIV. Because HIV is a shapeshifter. It shifts the cells to a degree, and it contracts and extracts them and elongates them. It does whatever it does to your cells and creates changes. And so basically shape shifts you. Like, I'm not the same shape that I used to be. Like, I literally am shape shifted now. And so I've learned a whole bunch of things in my cultural exploration and journey around being Two-Spirited, being gender diverse, that connects to that story about the shapeshifter and being, the HIV being a helper. So it has really kind of opened my brain and opened up my mind about life and the sanctity of life. Even though I have a chronic illness that could kill me and could have killed me, I was protected in some way, because like shoulda, coulda, woulda. I should not be here. I could not be here. I might not be here had I gone a different way. Like, if I had just got lost in addictions, I probably would not be here for sure. But yeah, family and trust in self and trust in the relationship with family. And like, no matter what, I'm going to trust that my sister's got my back. And they
Right. That's very interesting that you were like Martin, you were raised amongst female energy, and I don't know if that makes a difference. Maybe it does. It sounds like it does. But so your experience in disclosing your HIV status to your family was very different in terms of what Albert talked about, where there were people that were dying from AIDS-related complications who were not welcomed back home by their family. So there were few and far between scenarios like yourself. I believe. Am I correct to kind of assume that very few of us went home?
I would agree. I mean, I've heard horror stories of mothers who had who would accept their son, and it was a son in this particular instance, and he went home, and when the community found out, they harassed that family, and they eventually got he passed away, and they burned her house down. for fear that anybody who might be in that house would contract the disease. Now, what community was it? I don't remember. Who was it? I don't remember. It's one of those kind of First Nations legends that people talk about. But my heart just broke for that family and for that young man who passed away with that level of discord in his own home community. Someplace where, you know, all of us should be able to feel safe and protected and supported. And he was not, you know, and a lot of that has to come from fear and shame and guilt and finger pointing and judgments and all of those kinds of things. And that's not our traditional way. And so I'm so glad that I have a family that, you know, that really lives those protocols of kindness and compassion and love and acceptance. Now, we still have our bad days as family members. We still, you know, don't come to my place for a little while. But yeah, like nothing like, you know, I've never had to worry about my family coming in and burning my house down and telling me to get out. And I've never been denied, you know, come and stay with us, come and watch my kids. I'm on bush duty often these days with the grandkids, and nieces and nephews want me to watch their kids. I've never had children of my own. But all my sisters took care of all of that. So there's lots of them, so I don't have to worry.
Yeah, maybe we'll circle back to that that whole scenario at some point through this conversation, and because that's an interesting experience. Actually, when I read your story, I thought, wow. I think you're right to say it's the family, you know, and that trust. But maybe it's more than that too. But we'll circle back to that. I want to jump to Martin now. Martin, we wanted to actually have somebody that's kind of not living as long term as some of us. You know, somebody that came into the movement, because I remember when you came into the movement as a young person, and I thought, wow, look at this young, youthful person. And you came in tentatively. You were a bit tentative when you came into the movement. And anyways, as that younger person living with HIV in this panel, you've essentially are being passed the baton, so to speak. Like if we pass the baton in this movement, in 35 years of this movement that we've experienced already, some of us. So if you've been passed the baton to keep the HIV response moving forward, what does that feel like? And what are you currently doing to help future generations? You know, it's a big question.
Yeah, it's definitely like a big anti-energy question.
Yeah.
I think it's like important to give a little bit of context of like how I started to do the work. Just kind of like briefly is there was people that pulled me in to the circle, and I did have some light involvement you know, with CAN and other organizations, a little bit of volunteering at a much younger age. And so I did kind of make an appearance and met a few people. And then I left because there was some really dark places that I had to journey through in order to, I guess, be prepared and really grow as a human being. And I didn't come out unscathed from that. And even with the knowledge that I had about HIV, I still contracted it. I was still diagnosed with HIV. And I remember thinking, like, I need that family now more than I ever have before. And I don't know how to reconnect with them. And I'm not going to name names, but there was a really beautiful Indigenous woman that that was hosting a conference in Victoria at the time. And I reached out to her and I disclosed to her, and she said, we need you there. I really need you to be there. And so it was instances like that. And, you know, I started volunteering and really hearing the stories of other people living with HIV, and started to create and started to kind of pitch these presentations to these national organizations. And I started getting invited to these conferences. And it was at these conferences and at these gatherings where I was hearing these really powerful stories. And a bulk of those stories were coming from Indigenous women. And they were literally educating me through story. And I was so observant and I was so attentive. And they were literally demonstrating to me, this is possible. This is how I journey with HIV, and this is the work that I do in my community. And these are the results, and this is how we increase visibility, and this is how we elevate community, and this is how we gather our stories, and this is what grassroots looks like. That was probably the best education I could have ever gotten at that time of my life, because not only was it an education for my knowledge, but it was also medicine for my spirit, because I believe my HIV diagnosis did not just impact my physical body. It really impacted my spirit as well. And I needed that medicine. And so those Indigenous women and those Two-Spirit people and those HIV activists and people living with HIV, they helped me transform the way that I walk with HIV. And so it was through them that I became inspired to start doing the work. And there's some very specific instances of me going to these pharmaceutical, really scientific conferences where the majority of people were non-Indigenous. And me being invited there, feeling like I don't belong here, I'm a bush kid, what am I doing here? And having Indigenous women pull me to the table and sit me down and literally translate the knowledge of what they're speaking and giving me that information in a way that I could understand and take back into my own work and into my own communities or the regions that I was working in. And I remember like feeling overwhelmed at times, and other people living with HIV telling me, you belong here. There is a space for you. And so there was like, that is a demonstration of what working in the community looks like, of putting that hand down and pulling up those young people to the table. And welcoming them, including them in those circles. And so fast forward about a year from when that instance happened, when people were doing things like that for me, I did a project with this Two-Spirit trans woman who's also living with HIV, where we were around the same age, and we got invited to the United Nations in New York City to present one of our projects. And I remember we were standing outside of the UN in New York, and she was saying, I don't belong here. I'm scared. What am I going to say? What am I going to do? And I was able to demonstrate to her the same things and the same values and lessons that were taught to me about pulling somebody up, about elevating them. And so really that's been kind of my education in the movement, is like through the demonstrations of other activists and how they've included me, how they've engaged with me, and how they've kind of elevated me and given me opportunities to be a part of these conversations. So fast forward a few years later, I feel like there is a responsibility, and I feel that responsibility, and I don't think that it's an obligation. And I mean, it's scary to think about it as a baton, because in a lot of ways, like I still struggle with seeing myself like in leadership roles. I see myself just standing with community and just helping with coordination. I'm here as a helper. I'm here to help and serve. And so I think what's happening now in the work that I'm doing, and I really love what one of my colleagues, says, is like, we don't get to take our two-spirit hats off at night. Like, I don't get to take my HIV hat off tonight. I don't get to take my res hat off at night. And so we're living the work that we're doing. So this isn't just textbook stuff, like we're creating from a place that we're living. And so I think what's happening now in some of the work that I'm doing is really trying to engage community and make a lot of the initiatives a collective effort. And with this being said, trying to put a lot of focus on, community members and their voices. So just a quick example is I had a conversation with a young two-spirit person in Winnipeg yesterday. And I was telling them, hey, we're working on this initiative and just wondering what sort of experience you have doing this kind of work. And they were a bit intimidated and they were saying, oh, well, I'm not a professional this and I'm not an established that. And I said, that's not what we're looking for. And so we started to have this conversation about the community work, about the relationships they have, about the cultural knowledge they have, how they can kind of weave through their community as a two-spirit person, and that relationality and that establishment they have in community that I find to be the most, impressive and useful of all. So really looking to engage these younger community members in the work, establishing guidance committees of two-spirit people that can guide and offer recommendation to the initiatives that we work on. I think there's a real understanding, and this is what I'm learning more and more in the movement, is how much privilege I have to have access to ARVs, to have knowledge of U equals U, to have knowledge of PrEP, to live in an urban city center, because this isn't the truth and true for everyone across Turtle Island. We are still seeing HIV people diagnosed with HIV. There is increased rates happening. And just because some of us have access does not mean that all of us have access. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think a lot of that is just highlighting and making them visible and really advocating and pushing this knowledge forward that it isn't fair across the board. So you hear all these targets of these goals that people want to reach, and it might be happening in some parts of Canada, downtown Toronto, downtown Vancouver, downtown Montreal. We have knowledge and access to this stuff, but let's think about rural and remote communities, two-spirit people that journey into the city, that become vulnerable to HIV diagnosis, and then go back to their communities living with HIV and not having the support that they need in order to access. So I think another thing too, sorry, I'll try and close. I'll close with this. One thing I've noticed and I'm becoming more and more aware of is the limited visibility of Indigenous people in sexual health promotion and campaigning. We look at some big national organizations and there's a lot of focus on white, cisgender, gay men, and a lot of Western perspectives, a lot of Western knowledge, a lot of, and it's focused on these urban city dwellers that are non-Indigenous. So where are we in the medical system? Where are we in these campaigns? Where are we in this visibility? So I think moving forward for me, just as an individual, is really trying to coordinate collective efforts seeing value outside of academia. The way I view academia is how to move through a colonial world just to better support Indigenous people, and not use that in Indigenous communities, but really put a lot of value on community, their voices, and, you know, wisdom in community, right? And then just increasing visibility. So still very much like grassroots vibes. I've learned a lot from the aunties and the uncles and the cookums and the people that have adopted me. So it's, again, it's not an obligation. It's not something I intentionally set out to do. It just kind of unfolded that way. And I'm just really grateful for the Indigenous people that taught me and nurtured me and really helped me transform the way that I journey with HIV. And so that sense of responsibility is there. Yeah, so thank you.
Miigwech. Yeah, the aunties are very key in this movement. And we've been waiting for our next guest, Keisha. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, and not the bio version. Usually we're used to, you know, having somebody read your bio and all that, but we really just want to hear from you instead of having me or somebody else read your bio. And we also have a question for you. So we're going to weave the two together, Keisha. So the question for you is, you have had a remarkable journey with HIV as the first Indigenous woman to disclose your HIV status publicly in Canada. What was that like, being the first woman to come out as HIV positive? You traveled across the country to share your story. Why was that important for you? And what was the message you shared with the communities? So that question's in the chat box. If you wanna, I know there was like about 3 questions there. So let's meet Keisha first, and then you could respond to the question.
Just remind me how much time I have, sorry.
You have about 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me, Gaila Kesla. I'd like to say thank you to everybody who's here today. I believe there's a large community that has weaved a beautiful story and history, her story, our story in the Indigenous, Aboriginal, and HIV/AIDS community. I have, I guess, a long lived experience being HIV positive, and that really changed the trajectory of my life. One of the things that I think really helped me was the place that I was living and sort of struggling at this time in my life, being a young girl and a young woman out in my own, was challenging, but I grew up really fast. And currently I'm living in Lekwungen territory, which is the Coast Salish territory. I've lived here off and on since I was 5, and I have 2 beautiful children, my daughter Rakia and my son Owen. And I've always felt very grateful that I'm able to include them in my experience and my world. And she's met my children, definitely my daughter has met a lot of you, and a lot of you are considered aunties and uncles and brothers and sisters to her. So I just want to say Gaila Kesla for that. I've seen the new generation now really blossoming. I see the new generation now being able to balance and live and walk in two worlds and navigate, the challenges, no matter what those challenges are. And as a woman, I definitely have had my share of intersections, and that's just a fancy word for experiences with gender, violence, identity, culture. There are many different challenges when I first started even traveling. So right now I'm in my 50s, and I'm quite happy just where I'm at in my life. And it's very quiet. And I've been using the time as, I guess, a lot of reflection. And when I was asked to be part of this, it's a wonderful opportunity to share that. So once again, thank you so much. Being the first woman, and I guess youth, because I was 19, 18 when I found out. And I think it was just such a shock to the system at that time in the early 80s or late 80s and early 90s. There were a lot of people dying, and the language that was used was so different than it is now. Like, there's a lot of stigma that has been removed, especially from a lot more people who are out there doing the work and have been committed to removing that type of stigma and prejudice that a lot of us experienced when we first started talking about HIV and AIDS. It was very taboo, and if you talked about it, a lot of people assumed that you were HIV positive. A lot of people were very afraid. I was terrified to go into those doors of a non-Indigenous AIDS service organization, which would have been AIDS Vancouver and BC Persons Living with AIDS. And at that time, there were a lot of organizations available, especially in the 90s. And that's when the government responded in a bigger way. When I first started, I was talking to my family actually about my experience. And one of the things that we have or had done as, I guess, a practice in my family and a cultural thing is when you talk openly with, your family. So we had a family meeting at my aunt's house, and this was my time to disclose to my entire family. And at this point, it was just a few people that knew. And then more people started finding out. And I just thought, well, I better just tell everybody what's going on. And during that family meeting, I found a lot of support, a lot of love. But I was still so terrified, and I really didn't know what I was going to do. And my family just said, whatever you do, we support you and we love you. You haven't stopped being our granddaughter, our niece, my mom, my daughter, my brothers and sisters. Like, they were so accepting of, just of me. And that's such a big cultural teaching, that I didn't realize was being gifted to me at that time, which was compassion and acceptance and respect. And during that time, at that meeting, there was a woman there who was working for medical services branch, which is now was non-insured health benefits and then is now changed to First Nations Health Authority. But the provincial doctor, one of the doctors at that time, his name is Jay Wortman. He was a Métis doctor, and he was told about me, and sort of I said, you know, whatever I can do to tell people about what's going on in the city, I would like to tell people, like disclose and show people what's going on. Putting a face to it was really important to me because it broke a lot of myths about who was getting HIV. And so Jay proposed that he and I travel together. My first community that I went to was Ucluelet. I was terrified, petrified, just because I knew how fearful people were of HIV. And Jay was able to do the scientific stuff. I learned that later, but I just told my story. And storytelling is such a powerful way for us to connect to each other. And that became one of the first responses to HIV, was having somebody like me that doesn't fit the stereotype go out and travel. So once communities started hearing about this young woman who was me, they called me the AIDS lady out here. And it didn't offend me because at that time, even saying AIDS was a big deal. There was no medications. People were dying left, right, and center. People were being infected. So it was really important for us to get out there and show people, you know, this is happening in our communities. And through that, I met some amazing people like Licha Gita, Nolan Mamakizik, Dolan. Today's the 10-year anniversary for Dolan Badger, and I want to just recognize him and his 10-year of death. And it's also, for me, I met my first family of peers. They were my first family, Leonard Johnson and Frederick Hano, who started Healing Our Spirit. Just two spirited men who wanted to be there just as support. You know, when I did have to deal with a lot of challenging of myths, educating community, especially around taboo issues. Like, children were very curious at a young age. So when I would talk about HIV, they were so curious about sexuality. And that showed me at that point that they weren't getting the information they needed, you know. And I still have a funny feeling. I'm hoping it's changed, but I hope that there has been more people integrating it into spaces where people can connect or learn from it. And the new generation that we have, the intergenerations we have now, I believe we have from the 80s, 90s, 2000s. We've got a few generations now of people coming up 40 years or 30 some odd years of our community responding. And everybody that's here has been a part of that. You know, Martin and Doris. So we're in a very different time now. We're in a time where research is really big, where there are a lot more people who are expanding and challenging a lot of the history, but also the systems that are in place that push us down. And for that, I'm really excited. I'm grateful. And I appreciate the people that are doing that work, especially the policy work. It can be very hard and challenging. And the longer that people continue the voices, I always have hope. And I always believe that if I could reach one person, then I did my job, because there's going to be one person in that room who needs to hear what you said. And those were teachings that were passed on to me from elders that I met along the way, a lot of who are gone now. But I'd like to just also really quick wrap up. I also was I think in many ways, I challenged a lot of beliefs. And one of the things that I did was I got pregnant twice and I had 2 live births. I talk about my children a lot. My daughter started traveling with me at 3 weeks old to her very first conference. And I really pushed for change with having formula covered from the First Nations health branch, because for a lot of us Indigenous women, we couldn't breastfeed when we had a baby. So formula wasn't even covered in the formulary. And those are really fighting for childcare in sometimes a boys' club that really didn't, you know, value and put value into children being present, or young people or family members. So I'm so grateful that that's changed. People recognize how important it is to have families and children present. So I'm really proud of the way that people have become family and, you know, chosen or otherwise, but this is a larger extent of a family. So with that, I would like to say thank you. I want to just quick go back to the pregnancy thing. That was such a challenge because people were literally calling me a murderer. And were very upset. There was a lot of, I think, confusion and fear because they were just learning about HIV, and then all of a sudden there are challenges that we have to further break down. But those beliefs and the culture, sometimes religion, was very challenging. So being pregnant, I felt very vulnerable. And I had to step away for a while, actually, which was safe for me. But I'm very proud. I wouldn't change anything. And I'd just like to say Gela Kesla for having me here today. And I look forward to hearing the next person. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha. You certainly broke a lot of trails. You are a change maker. Like when you talk about that pregnancy, the first pregnancy you had, that's part of the stories that we hear sometimes when people are talking about looking back in the movement, and that took a lot of courage. Like I was wondering if you were going to bring that up. You know, you've done so much for the community, and we're so happy you're here to join this conversation today. You know, and I really wanted a woman here represented, you know, somebody living with HIV. I didn't disclose my own HIV status as the host of this conversation today, but this that's for another time. But I'm here to ensure that we have that woman voice here, that anti voice. So big anti energy to you, and much love. So I think we had another question that I think each of you had answered that question, but so I'm changing the questions that I sent you. So the last question, just rapid fire, is, you know, the movement has morphed into a lot of other tasks that look like they're much more important than that community grassroots voice. So how do we continue supporting that community grassroots voice amongst everything else that's going on? Like sometimes we feel like we've lost our places where our voices can be heard. How can we shift that, you know, as we move forward?
Yeah, I went back to the early days of activism, of ACT UP, and I'm really branding that now in Canada because I really see that HIV, along with other illnesses, are in the toolkit of genocide in Canada. And that the models that have been developed for us are not working because they're developed on Western ideology, Western logic models, don't take into account historic trauma or harm reduction or genocide. And so I'm really galvanizing the AIDS ACT UP energy from the early days where there was no treatment, where there was a lot of stigma and discrimination, because that's what's happening to us now. And the systems are not responsive. They're just, you know, there's no awareness and prevention for Indigenous people in Canada around HIV today. And we need it. You know, how many generations have grown up in the last 40 years? And I know governments assume everybody knows about HIV prevention or treatment or any of that. And it's not true. You know, the system had dropped the ball 20 years ago about doing thorough education and awareness. And that's why we have younger people being diagnosed with HIV, is they don't know what is out there, you know. And in Manitoba, we have more heterosexual transmission than among gay people. And you know, I was in Montreal at the International AIDS Conference, and I was looking at the booth on the female condom, which is very high tech today. But I knew in Manitoba, I could never promote it because no one would be interested, right? And this would be a great prevention tool for Indigenous women, but it's just not anybody's agenda. With that high level of technology that's evolved just with the female condom alone, you know, I would just be, you know, swimming upstream. I was just trying to get it to women, right? So yeah, I've become more of an advocate, an activist. You know, I'm brushing off my old advocate shoes and signs and bringing it back, you know, because people, like you're right, people have sat back on their laurels and thought everything was done, and it's not true. This is an active virus. We're still in the pandemic of HIV, right?
Right. Does anybody else want to kind of weigh into that, like the importance of grassroots, Keisha?
Actually, yes. When I first ended up on the streets, you know, the Downtown East Side Youth Association Society was created by a recovering heroin addict named John Turvey. And they ran not just a needle exchange program, which was harm reduction before it was even called harm reduction. And the idea was keeping the intravenous drug users who were using cocaine highly at that time. But they also had street nurses going out and handing out condoms and then different, like the bleach kits. Even though they weren't allowed to, they did it anyways. And to me, that was a successful program because they were able to connect with the women. And then when the bad date started, then they created a bad trick sheet. So these are evolving. These are tools that have worked in community for a very long time, especially communities like rural or urban populations. I just wanted to mention, I just came from an event, and an organization was able to get a hold of a bunch of HIV self-testing kits. But the question has been, how do we roll this out to community, to get it into the hands of community? And when Albert was talking about the female condom had a campaign out here with the BC Centre of Disease Control back in the 90s. And it was the same thing. It just didn't go anywhere. And I agree wholeheartedly with what he says. But now we're dealing with testing kits, COVID testing kits, HIV self-testing kits. But where do you go once you know? The pre and post test counseling has been taken out. So we're seeing these navigating programs after how long that people get tested and get positive. That worries me a little bit, especially in the rural communities. So definitely something I want to talk a lot more about. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha. I mean, yeah, I think there needs to be more conversation about those things, certainly, you know, and I know maybe we can jump to Martin because they've created the medicine bundle through the CBRC, and you might have an answer to the question that Keisha just raised in terms of the testing, HIV testing kits.
I think in regards to like Indigenous approaches to the HIV self-test kit, is prior to the medicine bundle pilot, consultations were being done with Two-Spirit and Indigenous queer and trans folks around the province of BC. And the intention of those consultations was to explore the feasibility of adequate testing and the HIV self-test kit in rural and remote Indigenous communities. And so the responses that we were getting in those consultations was Two-Spirit people expressing to us and identifying the needs and barriers that they were experiencing in their communities. And so a lack of confidentiality and anonymity, you know, we're all very much aware how alive and well racism is in the quote unquote healthcare system. Also like the intersectionalities of like gender identity or, you know, sexual diversity, Two-Spirit people, trans folks, you know, homophobia, transphobia, and then also just like the access of, you know, travel, finances, gas money, these kinds of things. And me being from a rural and remote community in the interior of the Yukon Territory, I understand when that physician or specialist comes to town, everyone knows why they're there. And when you line up outside of that clinic, it is known why you are there. And so these are the kinds of things, this is what I was saying about we live the work that we do. And so these consultations were really disheartening and hard to process. And we took these consultations and established a Two-Spirit guidance committee and brought the consultations to them and said, how do we respond? And so there is the pre-counseling and the post-counseling, that was a concern that was brought up, but the community spoke and they needed these HIV self-test kits. So we did the best that we could with what we had, created the medicine bundle, and then created a follow-up pathway of how they could access support and get in contact with Indigenous Two-Spirit people living with HIV, with a registered sexual health nurse, with one of the top doctors in BC to, you know, get linked to care, you know, to another Two-Spirit person who's like a strong advocate and very knowledgeable on PrEP, and really make that accessible to them. And then actually employed and hired people within those regions to disseminate the medicine bundle, to be there as a messenger, to be there as someone that could link them to other people living with HIV. And so the community spoke, and we had to respond. And so we responded to the needs and the barriers that were identified by these community members and made the HIV self-test kit available to them, put messengers within their health regions, brought them to the decision-making tables of how we were going to do it, tried our best to create those pathways, because I think they spoke and there was a responsibility to answer. And I just want to touch briefly kind of on what Doris said earlier about this community voice, is like, we put a lot of emphasis on academia. And for myself, I'm going to school. I've returned to school because other people have shown me that there's a space there for me. But I think that there's such expertise in the community voice. And I've seen this time and time and time again. Like I know an Indigenous woman in Winnipeg, tons of lived experience, been sober for 10 years, living with HIV, working with young people, and these young people just flock to her, and they're so open to her and tell her their stories and tell her what they need, and she's able to help them in a way that nobody else can. Like, where do you learn that in a textbook? So it's these relationships that these IPHAs, these Two-Spirit people, these Indigenous women have in their own communities, and the access that they have to those communities. So I think there's this collaboration of, okay, these Western sexual health resources work, but they need to be, those tools need to be given to Indigenous people so that they can take their, that kind of knowledge and help with the dissemination in community. And like, you know, are creating services, are, you know, elevating those community voices. So I think that's a lot of the work that's happened with the medicine bundle, is a collective effort, is bringing in a lot of other Two-Spirit and Indigenous people, consultations with Two-Spirit people, and really like putting a lot of focus on community-driven initiative.
Right. And, you know, all of you spoke to, like, when we think about community voice, you know, is there space for those community voices anymore in this response? And what I'm hearing is that that network is really key still. We still need that network of those community voices that are doing the work on the ground. And I think that's really vital, like putting stuff out on project basis too is problematic. Like, you know, that medicine bundle needs to be funded, for example. That's why I say that, and not fund it through project or something like that. Richard, I'm going to come to you. And before we, I just want to make an announcement to our listeners here that have joined us today for this very important conversation. We're going a little over, and please stay with us. And we'll come to some Q&A session after. I think we can go till maybe just before 3 o'clock, maybe 10 to 3. So we still have a bit of time. So Richard, I'm going to go to you now in terms of, you know, the importance of that community voice, that grassroots voice. Is there a place for that? Do we need to reinvigorate and bring that voice out again?
Well, given my history in gender identity and sexual orientation exploration and cultural knowledge gathering over the last 20 years, absolutely. One of the things that I've been kind of, you know, a little statement that's rattling around in my head is, beyond the family, what's the need for government? And I know that's kind of a provocative thing for some folks to even hear, particularly people who are on the line who work for the government. I'm one of them. I have a a part-time contract with Indigenous Services for Alberta region, do some work with the BC region, and it's all internal to the government work. It's not like reaching out to communities at this point. It's looking at what do we need to do inside the government, particularly that new department called Indigenous Services Canada. What can we do to help improve our internal supports for the people that work for the government? And how, and so for me in that space is how do I impact and how do I influence how they're getting ready to serve the two-spirit, gender diverse plus populations in our country? How does the government serve us? And I'm on one hand, I'm so happy that I'm in there. On the other hand, I wished I didn't have to. But I've got this kind of interesting place of kind of being in the middle place again. I'm an in-between person in so many ways. Because I'm mixed blood, part of me thinks like a settler. And because I'm mixed blood, part of me thinks like a First Nations kind of person when I'm deep in my cultural countenance or my character. And there's sometimes when I'm in that middle place of being a mixed blood person, a Métis, a half-breed, that allows me the privilege of being able to figure things out from a number of different perspectives. But it comes back to, how do we strengthen families in terms of being loving and kind and compassionate to their children and to their young people who are coming out as gender diverse. I'm non-binary, I'm gender fluid, I'm gay, I'm two-spirited, I'm all these different things. I don't want to kind of identify what I am or how I am. I just love people, whatever, like pansexual or bisexual. Like there's just that whole bundle of information and knowledge and practice and way of being as human beings. It's timeless. I mean, and you've had this kind of cultural interference that says, no, you have to bind yourself into this narrow binary experience called Adam and Eve experience or Jack and Jill or any of the other stories. Madame Thibault, if you took French in Western Canada, Monsieur Thibault and Madame Thibault. There wasn't a language that said there's fluidity, there's these other things. And you have kind of this cultural intervention called religion that kind of helped narrow us into, you got to walk this fine little line. And in the last 20, 30 years, we've really been pushing the envelope and reminding ourselves that we're more than Adam and Eve. We're more than Jack and Jill. We're more than all of that. And that's a pretty narrow definition of being a human being. And how do we connect to all of that information? And certainly religion has played its part in blocking, minimizing, preventing, mitigating against natural knowledge, natural law knowledge, and all of those kinds of things. So for me, it's we can't not empower and give back autonomy, and not even give back because they already have autonomy. Communities are autonomous. I just want to say that. But within the community, you have all these interrelated family groupings doing their own thing, and then love and desire and passion kind of requires them to integrate and connect with each other because this one's niece married that one's nephew, and that one's son married that one's wife, and that one's son is now with that one's son. And so there's all this interrelated connectedness. And so it comes back to, for me, beyond the family, what is the need for government? So it's a question not to like say, oh, I'm down with government, like get rid of government. No, it's how do we support as a governing process of human beings? How do we do that respects and acknowledges the varied ways of being and the belief filters that we all carry in a moment around how do we express our gender, how do we express our orientation, and how do we keep ourselves safe in that process, aka dental dams, female condoms, male condoms, all of that kind of safety stuff, safer sex. What is all of that stuff, and how does it maintain and support family, and still let new children come through, right? So somebody's got to be protected to be able to manage that process. And that's knowledge and knowledge transfer. And if you've got another culture saying you can't talk about that, we don't want you, you can't educate people about sexuality. That's too much. That's not your purview. It's like, well, yeah, it is, because I'm a parent and I have a responsibility to ensure that my child gets the best information possible about their body, their basic anatomy, and how their feelings, their passion, their drive, their desires impacts their day-to-day functioning. That's real. That's the most real thing about being a human, is our passion and our sexuality and our gender expression and all of that stuff. It's what typically gives us joy in a day, when we're able to find that and express that and cherish it. And so it's being able to shift out of this government knows best, and like academia knows best, and they know all the best ways to research and all do all that stuff. There's challenges that, when we send our young people off to academia, settler nation, higher education institutions, and then they come back, and then they want to implement all that information, and the information is culturally biased against the very community they're supposed to be helping. It's a challenge for the community. It's a challenge for the person who's gone to university. I didn't go to university because I figured, I had my brain for 12 years. I think that's enough. I want to have community teach me. So I went to work in community organizations called friendship centers and learned from amazing elders across the country, not just First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as well, but also some settler elders. There's some mainstream non-Indigenous, white, Caucasian, Black, Chinese, Asian, people from different cultures all over the world that are now living in our territories. And they have some amazing information. And, with just an open door and an invitation, they could come and share that. And we might be able to move through all of this gender-based violence stuff that's going on quicker, because old people will be supporting their children, parents of the new young people and the babies. And the life cycle will be able to move again, because it's a little bit stuck in shame and guilt and resentment and judgment and right and wrong stuff, morality, all of that stuff. And I just want to end with, my grandkids always remind me, when I get hurt, I feel hurt, laugh it off, mush it. It's what we do. And so as a Nahel, we're all about joking around, like crack a joke. Have those humor hormones race through your body and help reconnect you to your humanity and to your basic ability to laugh at all kinds of silly stuff that we do to each other as human beings and to ourselves. So thanks for listening. I know I kind of went on a little bit.
Oh, thank you, Richard. Yeah, we need to take those moments. And I see that with our people. We're, what's that word, self-deprecating sometimes with our humor. And it's sometimes I go, oh, okay, that's funny, but is it? So anyways, and it is usually funny. So we have some time for some questions here from, did you want to moderate the questions, Miranda?
Yeah, I guess the first question that
Okay.
we have was from Rajan. Everything else in the chat so far has been comments. And but Rajan, what was your question?
Hi, hold on, I'm not sure if you all are seeing me. Can you see and hear me? Yeah, you said my name right, which is great. Okay, so I actually have two questions. One is, so in light of what we've been seeing so far in Indigenous rights with the residential schools and the colonialism, and there's been a lot of recent talk about reconciliation in light of what's been going on with the residential schools. But in terms of the HIV Indigenous movement, how can awareness be raised to make this part of the talk of reconciliation? Because reconciliation covers everything, but then it will also cover the Indigenous. So that's the first part of my question. And then secondly, Martin, you were talking about accessibility and the to meds, and you touched a little bit upon the racism and the colonialism part of it. But in terms of accessibility, I know that there's PrEP and PEP drugs for HIV. So why is this being funded? Like, why this should be free? Because when you're talking about like accessibility, there are people who can't access this because of the cost. So then you're putting another barrier on top of trying to get what people need for help. So my questions again are, why should PEP and PrEP be reduced or free for accessibility? And then how can the HIV Indigenous movement be part of the conversations with reconciliation?
Well, I think with PEP and PrEP, PrEP has been available to First Nations as part of their treaty rights for quite a while now, but there's been never a campaign directed towards First Nations that it is available. And that's about, if you know it's there, you can ask for it and then we'll help you, but you have to find out on your own. That's why I mean that the awareness and prevention are not priorities anymore, but how are people supposed to guess that there is a drug that they could be taking that could prevent HIV, right? Like in rural, northern, and remote communities, people don't have access to Wi-Fi the way everybody else does, or cell phones, or laptops. Like in the South, we're making a lot of assumptions about how people are communicating and what information they get. So that's been a real dropped ball in Canada, is the awareness to First Nations that PrEP is covered and available. But again, you would still need to navigate the medical system to have monitored access to PrEP, which is another barrier. So those are just examples of sort of like Western, Southern style interventions that are not adaptive enough to the diversity of First Nations across the different, landscapes of Canada, like rural, on reserve, northern and remote communities. Like, they need to do better in terms of doing just general awareness out there and funding the supports. Like if someone goes on PrEP, that is a managed process, and you have to have a physician involved, and it's labor intensive, and someone has to pay for that, right? It just doesn't happen. You don't just get a script for PrEP because you want one, right? So again, for me, it's really, there is no strategies in Canada that directly advise on Indigenous people and HIV. We fit into larger strategies that are generalized to the major populations, and that's a huge gap.
Yeah, because I find, just to touch on that, because I find that like you can't have these conversations without people, without the people that you want involved. So like you can't talk about like HIV without having those like lived experience to talk, like to help consult. But I mean, when you look at the rates of HIV and who has access, it tends to be that the marginalized communities are underserved. They don't have the accessibility.
Well, it's always been part of the colonial plan for Indigenous people, right? And that's why we're overrepresented in all of these statistics around diabetes, suicide, HIV, syphilis, cancer. It's a product of colonization. And like I said earlier, genocide. It's been mentioned 3 times, one by our Prime Minister, one by the Pope, and one by the National Inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. But I don't see Canadians asking, why is there genocide in a 21st century nation like Canada, a first world country? Everybody's just moving on. It's odd.
Mm-hmm. Any other responses? Keisha and Martin.
Yeah. I just, hearing this question, I'm thinking we've had several provinces that have been consulted decades ago to create provincial Indigenous provincial policies for HIV and AIDS and for Indigenous people. And these have never been implemented. But this is part of the challenge, is we're often consulted for many different reasons, but a lot of those consultations, even within the HIV and AIDS community, if you're grassroots, they don't have a lot of power. And that it has been very frustrating knowing that these policies are sitting on a shelf somewhere. But I do believe that health in general has been dropped to a level that the rest of Canadians are starting to feel this equalizing going on, where everybody's getting kind of dropped through the system. That's all I have to say.
Martin?
Jessica D in the chat asked if anyone knew.
Martin was going to respond to that last question, Miranda. Martin?
I'm so tempted to pull in my colleague who's sitting in the room. He's like the PrEP knowledge person. We're actually like in the middle of creating a service provider module in accessing PrEP. And then also looking at an Indigenous focused PrEP campaign in a province in the prairies. And so we're in partnership working on these kinds of things. And it's actually, I think the mobilization of that kind of knowledge really needs to come from like that knowledge translation. When I think of it, I think of how do Indigenous people talk to each other? Like what sort of language do we use to communicate with one another? And how have I learned some of the knowledge? And I know that for me, a lot of it has come from story. And I appreciate Keisha putting an emphasis on the importance of storytelling and like how much knowledge can really be transferred through those processes. And so when I think about campaigning and in resistance to very white-centered, cisgendered sexual health campaigning, how I would love to see visibly Indigenous people sharing their experiences in accessing PrEP and how that improves the quality of their life and how it improves the quality of the lives that they're involved with and interact with. I think another thing around U equals U and addressing the kind of stigma of Indigenous people living with HIV is, you know, a lot of times I have seen the role that PAWS people play in that is like they play a huge role in that and carry a tremendous amount of weight and responsibility of having to be the advocates and the educators around U equals U, when really everyone has a responsibility in educating and understanding the benefits of undetectable equals untransmittable. So, you know, a mother, a cookum, a child, a partner in a serodiscordant relationship, non-Indigenous people, elders, we can all share that knowledge and mobilize that knowledge within our communities. And so there's some campaigning that we're going to be working on in the coming year. There's PrEP modules that we're creating in helping people access things like PrEP. And this is what I mean, like, I'll just end with this, is like, I live in downtown Vancouver. If I go down Davie Street and use the acronym U equals U, they're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. They're going to know exactly how to navigate. Oh, that's okay. They're either U equals U or they're on PrEP. This is knowledge we have in urban centers. But across Turtle Island, there is provinces, there is communities that have no idea what U equals U means or what we're referring to when I say undetectable. You know, like, and so I think that knowledge translation really starts in community conversation, and then us as Indigenous people mobilizing that knowledge amongst each other. So there's some big
because the reason why I was the reason why I was kind of bringing up the reconciliation part of it and then the prep part of it is because you can't reconcile, like you have to have the knowledge in order to reconcile. Because if you don't have the knowledge, what are you reconciling with and how are you going to reconcile?
Mhm. Thank you for that question. That really opened up a lot of responses. And I'm going to hand this over to Miranda now.
I think that you touched upon it as well, Martin, but before we go, Jessica D was asking if there's specific programs that would be available to her as a Métis person. But I think that you touched upon a program that you're running in the prairies. What is that called? Martin?
Sorry, I'm a bit distracted. I'm supposed to be meeting someone for lunch as like a work meeting.
Oh, I just wanted to ask the program that you're running in the prairies. What was that called?
So it's a partnership that's happening, but if anybody's interested in learning more, they can reach out to the Two-Spirit program at the Community-Based Research Center.
Great, thank you. I just want to close today and thank all of you for being here. It's been a wonderful conversation. There's been so much shared and so much learned. We're going to be posting this for the 91 people who joined up for this conversation today. This information is so necessary for communities, and I'm so grateful that you're all here to be able to share it. Albert, would you like to give a short close?
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. And we acknowledge those spirits that joined us to guide us, to hear us, to see us and listen to us, and to help us if they can. We understand the answers to our questions, our needs, our intentions will come in the future, and that we are told to be aware and to look and observe and recognize when we have received what the spirits have given us because of our work today. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Niawa, Nisichawayasihk. I just want to thank all of you and have a great day, and thank you all for being here.
Halakisla, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Doris.
Okay, thank you, Keisha.